Welcome back to Let's Talk Sports Radio right here on 94.9 Bob FM, brought to you by Gino's Pizzeria. Joining me now, the Deputy Commissioner and Chief Operating Officer of the National Basketball Association, Mr. Mark Tatum. Mark, thank you for joining us here on Let's Talk Sports Radio. How are you?
I'm great, Jordan. Thank you for having me on. Absolutely.
And you know what? I think for the listeners here, they recognize you, of course, because of your true Caymanian name, Tatum. However, if a listener or a reader will go out and Google you, obviously you have ties to the Cayman Islands. Your father was born here when it was Jamaica before Cayman's independence. But many people here will say you are a man that has family from the Brac. You are a Cayman Bracker, true and true. Is that correct?
Oh, without a doubt, So my grandmother, my great-grandmother, they all had their roots on Cayman Brac and all grew up in Spot Bay. And my dad still has a house in Spot Bay, and we spent a lot of time up on the bluff and under the bluff. So very, very familiar with Cayman Brac and the Cayman Islands.
You know, we'll start, of course, your role as the Deputy Commissioner. You lead a lot of the growth of basketball around the world, and the Caribbean is one place. You know, even here in the Cayman Islands, you know, we've recently entering our third year with the NCAA preseason tournament, the Cayman Islands Classic. You know, over the past 10 years, basketball players around the world are being drafted. You know, out of the Caribbean. You just look at DeAndre Ayton, Buddy Hield. A number of players, those are just from the Caribbean. Of course, even in Canada, of course, many Canadians live here in Cayman. A number of Canadians drafted with Caribbean roots. Andrew Wiggins, Tristan Thompson, just to name a few. The NBA is growing rapidly. What is there a future for the NBA in the Caribbean? Is that something that the NBA office is looking into? And if so, is there things that are on the horizon to grow basketball in places like the Caribbean?
Very much so. The Caribbean is a critical market for us. As you mentioned, going back to the Patrick Ewing days from Jamaica and Buddy Hield and DeAndre Ayton, Klay Thompson has roots in the Bahamas as well, Al Horford from the Dominican Republic. And so the Caribbean continues to be an important market for us. And what we're seeing is a trend of basketball growing throughout the world. 25% of our players today were born outside of the United States. That's 108 players in our league. And, we had our first non-U.S. team, Canada, and the Toronto Raptors win the NBA championship this year for the very first time. And we saw how that ignited an entire country with nearly 60% of all Canadians watching some of the NBA finals this past year. So we have tremendous ambitions for the Caribbean. We are introducing junior NBA programs throughout the Caribbean, and we hope to bring our first junior NBA league and junior NBA coaching clinics to Grand Cayman in the near future.
Well, that's fantastic news for a lot of athletes. The sport is growing fast here. You mentioned Canada. I can't do this interview without telling you that I am from Hamilton, Ontario, so I can tell you all Canadians were watching the NBA Finals here in Cayman. And, you're absolutely right. Canada, the Toronto Raptors, since its inception in 1994, its first NBA title, and really galvanized the country. And you could see that even in just the players coming in over the last, as I mentioned, Andrew Wiggins, Tristan Thompson, just to name a few, Kelly Olynyk, Corey Joseph, the NBA. RJ Barrett this year going to the Knicks. He's going to your old neighborhood. You grew up in Brooklyn, yes?
I did. I grew up in East Flatbush, Brooklyn, also known as the Little West Indies.
There you go. And you grew up as a baseball guy. I believe you went to Brooklyn Tech. You grew up baseball. You played baseball collegiately for Big Red at Cornell before you went on to Harvard. Let me ask you a question. You started as a baseball guy, and then I believe 99, you then joined the NBA's head office. How did you transition into becoming, I guess it's official to say you are a basketball guy now, but you started as a baseball guy. Did you have multiple interests growing up because I knew you played baseball, but where did your interest lie in basketball, and how did they shape as you grew professionally?
Absolutely. When you grew up in Brooklyn in the time that I did in the 70s and 80s, you grew up a basketball fan, and we played lots of basketball on our block. What we used to do in all hours of the night during the summertime is we used to take a milk crate, cut out the bottom of the milk crate, tie it to the lamppost so that we could play till midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning during the summer. And so basketball has always been a passion of mine. I just wasn't good enough to play at an organized level, at a high level. So unfortunately, I did play organized baseball. And as you mentioned, won a New York City high school championship in Brooklyn Tech, played at Yankee Stadium, then went to play at Cornell. And then after I graduated from business school, worked for Major League Baseball for a year. But my heart and I'd always admired the NBA for their marketing and their globality. And so when the opportunity came along in 1999 to come work at the NBA, I decided to jump on that. And it's been the best decision I've ever made. It's been 20 years last month where I celebrated my anniversary with the NBA.
Well, congratulations to that. I think it's a very admirable, path and journey that you've taken that many here in Cayman can aspire to do. And the sport itself has grown so much. You look at just the value of a franchise. The last franchise, to change hands in the NBA was the Bucks in 2014, and they sold it for $550 million, and it's now worth, over $1 billion. The sport is growing rapidly. You yourself, I understand, helped develop a digital platform in China, which is now, I believe you just renewed that relationship to get more basketball around the world and globally in people's hands and watching. I understand there's a statistic going out there. I read a report, 490 million people watched NBA programming in China. Talk about that initiative to get, what the NBA into China and how that has bared fruit for the league.
Yeah, so basketball is the number one sport in China. We have over 300 million people that play the game of basketball there, and they've been playing the game of basketball there since the early 1900s because James Naismith, who was a Canadian, who invented the game of basketball in Springfield, Massachusetts in 1891, he founded it, the YMCA. And he had the missionaries go out around the world and spread the game of basketball. And so missionaries brought it to China in the early 1900s. So they view the game as their own. They don't necessarily view it as an American sport because they've been playing it for so long. And so the deal that we did now there recently was with Tencent Sports. And Tencent puts on over 600 NBA games and makes available over 600 games to fans. And as you mentioned, nearly 500 million people watched NBA programming, over this past year. And so it's a very engaged fan base, consumers. They love the game. They're passionate about the game of basketball there. And we're so fortunate to have a great partner in Tencent, as well as CCTV as well.
And with a relationship like that, I'm going to draw a parallel to Canada. Obviously, the birth of the Raptors in '94, and now you see more Canadians in the league more than ever. There's obviously only been a handful of course, Yao Ming is the country's, ambassador and, arguably took the sport to new levels. Is the idea to get it into these markets to help grow and, have more professional Chinese basketball players? What does the success look like to the league as it relates to a relationship like this?
Well, I think there's a couple of different goals. One is we have fans all over the world, and what we want to try to do is make sure that we're delivering games and content to our fans wherever they are and however they're consuming their content. So that's first and foremost. Things like merchandise as well. We want to make sure that merchandise is available to them so that they can support their teams and support the players. But then we also do have initiatives around the world to grow basketball as a sport and to identify more and more talent from different countries. And in the last 2 years, we've opened up 7 different NBA academies, which are elite training centers for the best players in a particular country or region. We have 3 in China, 1 in Australia, 1 in India, 1 in Senegal, and then 1 in Mexico City. And the goal there is to bring in the best players in a particular region, bring in the coaches who have NBA experience and college experience, who know how to develop elite basketball players and NBA players, and put them in an environment where they can actually reach their full potential. And so, the goal and the hope is that there will be more players that come out of China, that there will be more players that come out of India, Europe, Africa, and all over the world, given how global we are as a sport.
You've had a hand in a lot of great projects for the NBA that have focused on development. Another great one that you have had a big role in is the development of the G League. This past season, there's been 28 G League teams, almost one, per team. Again, speaking to the Raptors, it really, if it's done properly, it really, really does see success. You look at the Raptors championship winning team, Fred VanVleet, Norm Powell. Now, you have, of course, Pascal Siakam, the NBA's most improved player, all developed in their G League team right down the QEW down the highway. Talk about, your success in developing the G League into what it is now, which, is essentially a farm system for teams to really cultivate talent and then bring into their roster and see success for players that essentially can't make the opening day roster, but still, want to own rights and develop players. Talk about the G League and how that's developed under your watch.
Yeah, it's truly become the second best basketball league in the world. Half of NBA players have now spent time playing in the G League. As you mentioned, it allowed players like Fred VanVleet and Pascal Siakam to really grow their game and thrive and have the confidence necessary that they could come in and compete at the NBA. Danny Green as well. This year's NBA champions was a great example, and having those players play for the Raptors 905, being able to get playing time on the court as opposed to sitting at the end of the bench, and being able to come in and have an immediate impact on the court. It's critical to have G League teams like that. We're very close to, as you mentioned, having 1-for-1, so 30 G League teams. We expect that the final 2 teams will have G League teams soon, because it's proving to be such an incredible asset for teams to be able to develop young talent and help them reach their full potential.
And of course, the sport here in in North America, I say here, I'm in Cayman, but the sport in North America, 3 years ago, the league re-signed or drew an extension with ESPN and TNT, $2.4 billion. You've been with the league 20 years. How I believe this is one of the richest television deals in history, but talk about how the sport has grown while you've been with the league. What has been the biggest change in basketball while you've been in your role?
I think one of the biggest changes has been the globality of the sport. And again, having 25% of our players now coming from outside the U.S. and, our MVP is a Greek player. Our Rookie of the Year, so that's Giannis Antetokounmpo from Greece, also by way of Nigeria. Our Rookie of the Year is a Slovenian player, Luka Doncic. Our Most Improved Player is from Cameroon, Pascal Siakam. And our Defensive Player of the Year is a French player, Rudy Gobert. So, the international influence, not just playing in our league, but winning the best awards in our league and having the biggest impact in our league has really been one of the biggest differences that I've seen over the course of 20 years.
And one thing that has obviously changed a lot, more money coming into the league, bigger contracts for players. You look over the last 5 years and it looks like players and their teams are becoming more savvy, taking shorter term deals to team with players and, just different machinations of how teams are put together. As the league, as it relates to entertainment, and does the league like the fact that players, switch teams, I guess, a little bit more frequently as a means to kind of getting to their goal of winning a championship? Of course, you have, Kevin Durant going to the Warriors and now going to the Nets. Especially this offseason, there was huge money signed. Even, Kawhi Leonard wins the MVP with the Raptors and then goes and signs with the Clippers. Does the league believe that is that good for basketball? Is that good for fans? Like, what is the stance of the league on, the changing of players and taking short-term contracts as opposed to even just 5 years ago where a lot of players were taking longer-term deals?
Well, I think what you're seeing is it's a function of our new collective bargaining agreement, where we have shortened the number of years, and it's interesting that was designed really for both ways, right, for both teams and players, and so it creates really a balance of power between players and teams. In the old days, there used to be players who were under contract for many, many years and had long-term guaranteed contracts, but they had really outlived their performance and were getting paid more than what they were actually delivering on the court. And so the shorter contracts really allowed both teams and players to reset. For the players, they have the opportunity in free agency to go to a place where they think they have the best chance of winning. And we saw a lot of that in being able to choose a team where they think that a team that's well managed and is giving them the best chance of competing for a championship. I think at the end of the day, that's what our players want. That's what our teams want. And what you're seeing is this is really a function of the collective bargaining agreement as we negotiated that with the Players Association recently. So, and there's no doubt that it's created a lot of excitement in the off season in anticipation of where players are going to end up, what the new looks are of different teams, how those teams come together. And so I think that's overall been a very, very positive for the league.
I want to jump back to the Raptors really quick. Of course, again, winning their first NBA title, a big offseason acquisition for the Raptors was getting a Christmas Day game. It's a big thing in the Canadian media that the Raptors finally get to play on Christmas, as it relates to television. But there's always been kind of a skewed perception of how the NBA sees the Raptors. I think in general, as a Canadian, you're always interested to see how the American media and Americans in general, how they're viewed. I guess that's just a Canadian thing. I don't know. Now that the Raptors have won, you know what it is? It's just a weird thing. I don't know what it is. How does the NBA feel they can capitalize on the Raptors winning the championship? Is getting a Christmas Day game, is that like a sign of good things to come? Like, what is once the Raptors won the title? Because obviously it's the first Canadian team to do so in the history of the league. How did the NBA did the NBA sit down and say, okay, how can we expand basketball in Canada, or how can we help assist it? Was that conversation had? And if so, what types of things will we see for basketball in Canada?
Yeah, no, they're the NBA champion, and you've got to have the NBA champion featured in your marquee matchup. So opening night, for example, during the ring ceremony, they're going to be featured, and Christmas Day, they're going to be featured, and they've got an incredible team and with an incredible story. You've got they featured 5 international players, and that team really did symbolize how global our league is. Their president of the Raptors is Masai Ujiri, who's from Nigeria. We mentioned Pascal Siakam from Cameroon, Serge Ibaka from the Congo, Chris Boucher from Canada, Marc Gasol from Spain, and OG Anunoby from Great Britain. And so what a perfect example of a global team in our only market outside the United States as an NBA champion. And I think it's we like to showcase the great teams that we have in the NBA in media and in other ways. And this was just a fantastic reward for the performance that they've had on the court, but also how they carry themselves off the court. They're a well-managed franchise. The chair of Major League MLSE, Maple Leaf Sports and Entertainment, is our chair of the board, Larry Tannenbaum. So it's just such a well-run organization, and a pleasure to be able to feature them and showcase them as the NBA champions and one of the best teams in our league.
I know you're a busy man, so I'm only going to ask you 2 more questions, and I'll let you get on with your day. Again, I do really appreciate you giving me some of your time today for this interview, Mr. Tatum. You've had 2 decades with the NBA office. There are Caymanians that are listening to this and maybe aspire to work in sports administration, aspire to work in marketing and corporate partnerships. What do you attribute your success to and your longevity with the league, which you have essentially one of the most important positions in sports across the entire world? What do you attribute your success to?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. One is I love what I do, and I would encourage any young folks out there to find your passion and pursue it. It was for me, when I identified that this is what I wanted to do, I pursued it with a passion. I treated it like it was a full-time course, a full-time job, and went out and built networks and talked to people and pursued it relentlessly. So I would certainly encourage that. And then the second thing is working hard. Working hard, respecting people, being curious. I think those are all things that I would encourage anybody out there listening who wants to pursue, whether it's a career in sports or some other field. Work hard, be curious, ask questions, and get to know as many people as you can in that field, and then good things will happen.
And last but not least, will there ever come a day that a NBA game, exhibition, or regular season be played in the Cayman Islands?
I sure hope so. No, look, I think we're going to start off with creating more junior NBA programs there, grassroots programs. We recently just did a Basketball Without Borders camp in the Bahamas, and that's an elite camp for the elite kids in the Latin America region. I could see that coming to the Cayman Islands. And then eventually, I would love to see a game of some sort come to the Cayman Islands. So hopefully, in my tenure, that certainly will happen.
And if that does happen, there will be a front row reserved for all people with the last name Tatum. I'm sure of it. That's for sure.
If we can fit them all courtside.
you know they will fly in from the BRAC if they're not already on Grand Cayman. Deputy Commissioner and Chief Operating Officer of the NBA, Mr. Mark Tatum, thank you so much. I really appreciate you giving us some of your time today on Let's Talk Sports Radio. Thank you, Mr. Tatum.
Thank you, Jordan. I appreciate it.
All right, more Let's Talk Sports Radio right here on 94.9 Bob FM. Stick around. 94.9 Bob FM.